The sun was beginning to sink over the dry, windswept plains when she appeared on the horizon. To the people of the small frontier town of Hollow Creek, the sight of a lone figure walking down the dusty road was nothing unusual. Travelers passed through now and then, though fewer in recent years as the trails became more dangerous. But something about this woman was different. Even from a distance, the way she carried herself drew every eye. She wasn't slouched under the weight of exhaustion like most wanderers. Her steps were measured, steady, purposeful, as if she already knew exactly where she was going. A rifle, long and weathered, rested across her back, strapped in a way that suggested it had been used often. And in her hands, clutched tightly against her chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the world, was a worn, leather-bound Bible. The children playing marbles in the dirt stopped mid-game to stare. An old man, sweeping the porch of the saloon, leaned on his broom, his squinting eyes following her every step. Mothers gathering laundry off the lines called their little ones inside, though not in fear, more in reverence, like something sacred was walking by. Hollow Creek had been a town stripped of hope for far too long. Months of lawlessness had beaten down its people. Bandits roamed freely, storms had ruined crops, and disease had carried away too many lives. Fear hung in the air, heavier than the dust that coated every street. Folks spoke less, smiled rarely, and prayed quietly, though many had stopped believing their prayers were heard at all. So when the stranger walked in, calm and unshaken, a rifle on her back and the word of God pressed to her chest, the whispers began almost immediately. She was sent by God, someone muttered from the doorway of the general store. She's no ordinary woman, another voice followed. Look at her eyes, an old widow whispered as the stranger passed. Steady, like she already knows the ending, the woman gave no answers, no greetings beyond a small nod to those who dared meet her gaze. She didn't look lost, nor desperate, nor afraid. She seemed to belong, as if the dust beneath her boots had been waiting for her all along. Sheriff Alden, a weary man with lines of worry carved deep into his face, stood on the steps of his office, watching her approach. His instincts had kept him alive in a town on the edge of ruin, and those instincts told him this woman was trouble or salvation. Maybe both. He chewed on the inside of his cheek, saying nothing as she passed, her boots thudding softly against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. She stopped only once, just long enough to lift her eyes toward the church at the center of town. Its white paint had long since peeled away, and its steeple leaned slightly, but the bell still hung, silent for weeks now. She bowed her head briefly, whispering something no one could hear, and then continued on her way. By the time she reached the boarding house, the whole town was buzzing. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, asking who she was. Men at the saloon argued in hushed tones, some claiming she was a bounty hunter, others swearing she was a widow running from her past. But the most common belief, the one that spread fastest, was that she had been sent by heaven itself. Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Callahan, a stout woman with a kind face, greeted her with cautious curiosity. "You looking for a room, miss?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. The stranger nodded once. "Just a place to rest," she said, her voice low but firm, carrying the faintest trace of weariness. Mrs. Callahan glanced at the rifle, then at the Bible. "Long road?" "Long enough," the woman replied, and nothing more. That night, as she sat alone in her room, the oil lamp casting soft shadows across the walls, she opened her Bible. Its pages were yellowed, edges frayed, filled with underlines and scribbles that only she could understand. She traced her fingers across a verse, whispering words that seemed more like a plea than a prayer. Outside, the town slept uneasily, but she remained awake, eyes sharp, listening to every sound in the dark. The people didn't know yet what she carried, not just the rifle or the Bible, but something heavier, hidden deep inside. Guilt, memory, a past carved in blood. But none of that showed in her face. To Hollow Creek, she was a savior who had arrived at the perfect time. By morning, the legend had already begun. Children claimed she had eyes that glowed in the moonlight. A farmer swore he saw her kneel and pray until dawn without moving an inch. Mrs. Callahan told her boarders that the woman spoke like someone carrying a burden, too great for one soul, yet still walked tall beneath it. The town, desperate for hope, believed what they wanted to believe. And what they wanted was a miracle. The woman gave no speeches, no promises. She simply walked the streets that day, observing, her rifle never far from reach. When she passed the blacksmith, he nodded respectfully. When she stopped at the well, the children watched her as though she were an angel drawing water. But behind her steady gaze, shadows flickered. She felt the weight of eyes on her, the weight of expectation. They thought she was sent by God. She knew better. As the sun dipped low again, painting the horizon in streaks of red and gold, she climbed the hill outside town and looked back at Hollow Creek. The church bell tower stood crooked. The saloon doors swung lazily in the evening breeze, and lanterns flickered to life one by one. She tightened her grip on the Bible, her other hand brushing against the rifle strap. Whispers carried up the hill, people already calling her their protector, their angel, their salvation. She closed her eyes. If only they knew the truth. And so she stayed. Not because she believed she was sent by God, but because she knew danger was coming. And when it arrived, she would be ready. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon when Hollow Creek began to stir. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors. Children carried buckets to the well, and farmers brought their goods to the market square. It was an ordinary morning, ordinary, for a town that had grown used to living with one eye always on the horizon, fearing the next raid. The stranger, the woman with the rifle and Bible, had not yet spoken much to anyone, but her presence was felt everywhere. When she passed through the market, people stepped aside instinctively, not out of fear, but with a strange kind of respect. She had an aura about her, steady, unshaken, almost divine. That morning, as she lingered near the fruit stand, turning an apple in her hand, trouble came to Hollow Creek. It began with a thunder of hooves in the distance. The ground trembled faintly before the sound became clear. Riders fast, reckless, and many. Mothers snatched their children from the street. Men reached for pitchforks, rifles, or anything they could carry. Sheriff Alden rushed out of his office, barking for people to take cover. Everyone knew what was coming. The bandits. A group of 6 stormed into town, dust rising behind them like a storm. They whooped and hollered, firing pistols into the air to scatter the crowd. Merchants scrambled to cover their goods as the riders charged through the square, one leaping from his horse to snatch a sack of grain, another dragging a screaming boy by the collar before tossing him aside with a laugh. Sheriff Alden stood his ground, revolver raised, but he was only one man against 6, and the townsfolk knew he had neither the speed nor the firepower to drive them away. Hollow Creek was seconds away from falling into chaos. And then she moved. The stranger climbed onto the wooden cart at the edge of the square, her movements calm, deliberate. She unslung the rifle from her back in one smooth motion, her fingers working with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The crowd froze, every pair of eyes snapping toward her. Crack! Her first shot split the air like lightning. A bandit's pistol flew from his hand, clattering uselessly to the ground. The outlaw yelped, clutching his stinging fingers, stunned by the impossible accuracy. Crack! Another shot. This time, the bullet struck the dirt at the hooves of a charging horse, sending the animal rearing up and its rider tumbling to the ground. The crowd gasped. Mothers covered their children's ears. Some prayed aloud. But the woman did not falter. Her eyes were sharp, focused, unshaken. She reloaded with swift, practiced motions, her breath even, her stance unyielding. Crack! A third shot struck the brim of a bandit's hat, spinning it clean off his head. He froze, pale-faced, realizing the bullet could just as easily have torn through his skull. The message was clear. She wasn't missing by accident. She was choosing not to kill. The market fell silent, except for the ragged breathing of terrified townsfolk and the snorts of restless horses. The bandits, once rowdy and confident, now looked uneasy. They had seen skilled shooters before, but nothing like this. Sheriff Alden, seizing the moment, raised his revolver again. "You heard her," he barked, though she had said nothing. "Drop your weapons and get out of Hollow Creek." One of the bandits snarled, lifting his pistol toward her. The crowd screamed crack. Her bullet struck the weapon clean out of his hand before his finger could touch the trigger. The outlaw howled in pain, clutching his wrist. She didn't even blink. The leader of the gang, a scar-faced brute with a black hat, spat into the dirt. He scanned the crowd, then looked back at the woman on the cart. She hadn't spoken a word, yet her silence carried more weight than all their threats combined. "Mount up," he growled finally, his voice tight. The bandits didn't argue. They scrambled onto their horses, eyes darting nervously toward the stranger's rifle. Within moments, they were gone, vanishing in a cloud of dust the same way they had come. Only then did she lower her rifle. For several heartbeats, no one in Hollow Creek spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with disbelief. Then slowly, the whispers began. "She saved us. Did you see her aim?" Like she was sent by heaven itself. Mothers hugged their children tightly, thanking God for her. Men removed their hats, staring at her with awe. Even Sheriff Alden, who had been suspicious from the start, couldn't hide the look of grudging respect on his face. But the woman didn't smile, didn't boast, didn't bask in the praise. She simply slung her rifle back over her shoulder, stepped down from the cart, and picked up the apple she had dropped when the chaos began. She bit into it calmly, as if nothing had happened, as if saving an entire town from slaughter were no more remarkable than a morning stroll. That night, Hollow Creek buzzed with stories. The children told and retold how she shot the gun right out of the outlaw's hand. Old men swore she never blinked once. Women praised her as an angel sent to protect them in their hour of need. The name, Protector, began to take root in whispers and prayers. But alone in her room, the woman sat with her Bible open on the table. She didn't pray for gratitude or glory. Her hands trembled slightly as she ran her fingers over a verse about redemption, about sins forgiven. The rifle leaned against the wall, polished and ready. She stared at it for a long time, her face hard, unreadable. The town thought she was a miracle. She knew she was something else entirely. After that morning in the marketplace, the town of Hollow Creek no longer looked at her as a stranger. To them, she had proven herself in a way words never could. They had seen her rifle speak, and they had seen it speak with the voice of salvation. From that day on, wherever she went, eyes followed her, not with suspicion, as before, but with reverence. Children trailed behind her in the streets, whispering and giggling, daring each other to get close enough to touch her coat. Mothers waved to her from porches, with baskets of laundry at their hips. The men, though less willing to admit their awe, tipped their hats whenever she passed. Yet she accepted none of it. Her steps remained steady, her face unreadable, her words few. She refused offers of free meals at the tavern, declined coins slipped into her hand, and ignored the townsfolk who tried to pull her into their conversations. She did not come for praise or comfort. Her life had been built too long on silence, and in silence she remained. Still, though she never asked for trust, she gave protection freely. One evening, she found a boy crying outside the schoolhouse, his face scraped, his knees bleeding. He had fallen from the fence while chasing a ball. Without a word, she crouched beside him, tore a strip from her own sleeve, and wrapped his wounds. When the boy sniffled, she pressed her Bible into his hands and pointed to a verse about courage. The boy couldn't read, but he carried that page with him for weeks, showing it off like a treasure. Another day, a storm rolled through Hollow Creek, tearing shingles from roofs and toppling part of the mill. As the winds howled, she helped Mrs. Callahan drag her laundry line inside, shielding her with her own coat from the lashing rain. Later, when the barn belonging to the Miller family caught fire from a lightning strike, she ran into the smoke, coughing and stumbling, but carrying out their youngest son in her arms. By morning, her hands were blistered raw, but she never spoke of it. The people began to tell stories exaggerated, perhaps, but stories that bound the town together. They said she never slept, only walked the streets with her rifle beneath the moonlight, keeping watch for threats no one else could see. They said wolves came down from the hills one night, but turned back when they caught sight of her eyes glowing in the dark. They said her prayers could calm crying infants and silence storms. The church bell, long silent, rang again that Sunday. The preacher declared that God had not forgotten Hollow Creek, that he had sent an angel with a rifle to shield them. The pews were fuller than they had been in years. The people prayed harder, sang louder, and looked to the woman as living proof that heaven still intervened in earthly matters. But not everyone was convinced. Sheriff Alden remained cautious, his instincts gnawing at him. He respected her skill, yes, but he also knew no ordinary woman gained such precision by chance. A rifle like hers didn't speak with mercy, unless it had spoken before in blood. He kept his questions to himself for now, but his eyes never left her when she passed. For the woman, life moved quietly. She took to walking the edge of town each morning, scanning the horizon as though expecting trouble. At night, she sat at the boarding house window with her Bible open, though more often her gaze lingered on the rifle propped beside her. The townsfolk thought her prayers were for them. They didn't know they were for herself, for forgiveness, for a past that still burned in her memory. Sometimes, late at night when the town was quiet, she dreamed of voices. Laughter around a campfire, horses galloping under the stars, the thunder of gunfire, the screams of those who hadn't been fast enough. She would wake with her hand on the rifle, sweat beading her brow, the sound of her old life echoing in her ears. But in the daylight, she wore no fear. One afternoon, she came across a group of children near the well. A pack of older boys had cornered a younger one, taunting him, pushing him until he tripped into the dirt. The woman stepped between them without a word. The older boys froze, wide-eyed at the sight of her. She didn't raise her rifle or speak a single threat. She only stared, her eyes sharp and unyielding. That was enough. The boys scattered, stumbling over each other to escape her gaze. She helped the younger child to his feet, brushed the dirt from his clothes, and sent him home with a pat on the shoulder. The townsfolk watched these small moments, these simple acts, and added them to her legend. To them, she wasn't just a protector with a rifle. She was a guardian of the weak, a saint disguised in dust and leather. Every life she touched became part of the count, though no one realized they were keeping it. A boy saved from bullies, a family sheltered during a storm, a child pulled from a burning barn. Each story spread, each tale retold in the tavern or whispered in the pews. The number grew, and with it, the belief that she had been sent not by chance, but by providence. Yet she carried herself with the same silence, the same distance. Her eyes betrayed nothing, but inside, her heart carried the weight of every sin she had ever committed. Hollow Creek saw her as a savior. She knew herself as a sinner, trying to outrun the shadow of who she had been. And though the people believed they were safe now, she knew danger always returned. It had a way of finding her. So she stayed watchful, rifle ready, Bible close, and the town slept easier because of it. The weeks after the marketplace incident settled into a rhythm unlike anything Hollow Creek had known in years. For the first time in recent memory, the people felt something fragile but powerful stirring in their chests. Hope. And at the center of it all was her. The woman became a quiet constant in their lives. She was seen at dawn, pacing the outskirts of town, eyes sharp on the horizon. She was seen at dusk, leaning against the church steps with her Bible resting in her lap. She was seen when danger struck, moving faster and surer than anyone else. Each time she intervened, someone lived who might not have. And soon, people began to count. It started small. 3, whispered Mrs. Callahan one morning at the boarding house table. 3 lives she's saved now. Little Thomas from the burning barn, that farmer she pulled out from under his wagon, and the preacher's wife when she nearly drowned in the creek. Others added their own. 4, the blacksmith insisted. You forgot young Clara, the one who nearly choked on an apple. She was there. Within days, the number was on everyone's tongue. Each story repeated, each tally kept, as though Hollow Creek were witnessing a living miracle unfold before their eyes. 5, 6, 7. The children scribbled the numbers in the dirt with sticks. The preacher worked them into his sermons, declaring that the Lord himself had placed a guardian among them. By the second month, the count had reached 15. But numbers are heavy things. The woman felt the weight of each one pressing against her chest. Every saved life reminded her of lives lost in another time, another place. At the end of the same rifle, she now carried like a cross. When the townsfolk marveled at her accuracy, they didn't know it was perfected in blood. When they spoke of her bravery, they didn't know it was born from survival in the darkest corners of the frontier. She never corrected them. She never spoke at all. But in the quiet of her room, when the oil lamp flickered low, she would trace her finger across the open pages of her Bible, landing on verses about judgment, about mercy, about the scales of sin and redemption. And she would wonder if numbers mattered to God, if 25 saved could ever outweigh the many taken. The town, however, saw only the miracle. There was the time a farmer's ox broke free, thrashing wildly through the square, horns sharp and deadly. Before anyone could be trampled, her shot rang out one clean crack that split the yoke without touching the beast's flesh. The ox stumbled, dazed but unharmed, and the farmer fell to his knees thanking her. There was the time a traveling merchant tried to cheat the widow Hensley, demanding double payment for flour she desperately needed. The woman appeared without a word, her shadow falling over the scales. The merchant, looking into her unblinking eyes, lowered his price without protest and left town before nightfall. There was the night the Miller twins wandered too far into the hills and failed to return. The townsfolk searched in panic, but it was she who found them huddled together in the dark, cold, and lost. She carried one twin on her shoulders and held the other's hand the entire walk back. The town greeted them with cheers, and the preacher declared that the count had reached 20. 20 lives, 20 miracles, 20 reasons to believe. By then, stories of her had begun to spread beyond Hollow Creek. Travelers passing through carried the tales to nearby settlements. They spoke of the nameless woman with the rifle who saved without fail, who walked like a soldier but prayed like a saint. Some townsfolk even claimed other villages were sending desperate letters to Hollow Creek, begging for her to come to them. But she never left. She stayed, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something the others could not see. Sheriff Alden watched her more closely than ever. He didn't join in the counting, didn't sing her praises at the saloon, didn't call her a saint. He respected her skill, he had to. But his gut told him that behind her silence lay a truth the townsfolk wouldn't want to hear. And when he saw the way her hands sometimes trembled after a perfect shot, or how she prayed longer than anyone else in the church, he knew she carried a burden no miracle could erase. Still, the town didn't see the cracks. To them, she was flawless. To them, she was proof that heaven had not abandoned them. When she passed, people touched her coat as though it might bring them luck. When she entered the church, heads bowed lower, voices sang louder. When she walked the streets at night, lanterns seemed to glow brighter. By the end of the third month, the count had reached 25. The number echoed in every corner of Hollow Creek. Children recited it before bed. The preacher carved it into his sermons. The blacksmith painted it on the wall of his shop. 25 lives. 25 miracles. 25 reasons to believe she was sent by God. And yet, when she looked into the mirror that night, her face pale in the lamplight, she did not see a savior. She saw the outlaw she had once been, the woman who had lived by the rifle, who had left bodies behind on dusty roads, who had disappeared into the wilderness with blood on her hands. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, whispering the number under her breath. 25. It did not make her feel lighter. It only reminded her how heavy the rest of the numbers still were, the ones no one in Hollow Creek would ever know. She closed her Bible and set it beside her rifle, staring at both as though they were chains. The people saw her as their protector. She knew the truth. The count was not redemption. It was only delay. And she could feel the past creeping closer, step by step, like the shadow of something that never stops following. By the time the count reached 25, the woman was no longer just a protector in the eyes of Hollow Creek. She was something more. Something higher. Something divine. The town had begun to change. Where once silence hung heavy, laughter now spilled through the streets. The tavern's piano, long neglected, played again. The church pews filled each Sunday, not because of the preacher's words, but because people wanted to see her kneeling in the front row, Bible pressed against her chest. It was as though she had breathed life into a town that had been half dead for years. And with life came reverence. The church bell, silent for months, rang out the morning after she saved the Miller twins. Its echoes rolled across the hills, announcing not just survival, but salvation. The preacher declared it a holy sign. God himself had sent this woman, rifle in hand, to guard his flock. Soon, every act of hers was seen as sacred. When she stopped by the bakery and bought a loaf of bread, the baker's wife swore the bread stayed warm for hours longer than any other loaf. When she touched a crying infant's forehead, the child quieted instantly, and the mother proclaimed it a blessing. When she walked the streets at night, people claimed the shadows parted for her, as if light followed her steps. The stories spread like wildfire. "She's an angel in disguise," murmured Mrs. Callahan to anyone who'd listen at the boarding house. "No," argued the blacksmith, eyes shining. "She's more than that. She's a saint. God's chosen." And the name stuck. The Saint of Hollow Creek. It was whispered in taverns, preached in sermons, sung by children in playful chants. Travelers passing through carried the title with them, spreading it to towns beyond the hills. Hollow Creek, once a forgotten dot on the map, became a place of pilgrimage. Strangers came to see her, to touch her coat, to hear her voice, to watch her pray. She, however, wanted none of it. She accepted no gifts, refused extra food, turned away offerings of money and jewelry. When the preacher asked her to speak in front of the congregation, she shook her head, eyes lowered. She never sought their reverence. But the less she sought it, the more they gave. To them, her humility only proved her holiness. Sheriff Alden, however, saw through it. He sat in the back pew on Sundays, hat low, eyes sharp. He watched her kneel, watched her lips move in silent prayers, watched the congregation bow deeper than ever before. But he also saw the flicker in her expression, the faint tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers sometimes trembled on the pages of her Bible. He saw guilt where others saw grace. One evening, after the church bells rang in her honor again, Alden found her standing alone by the riverbank. The water shimmered silver in the moonlight, her reflection broken by ripples. "You know they're calling you a saint now," he said, his voice low. She didn't look at him. "I'm no saint. Try telling them that." Her silence stretched, heavy as stone. Alden studied her profile, the sharp lines of her face, the shadows in her eyes. "What are you running from?" he asked finally. Her head turned slowly toward him, her gaze hard, piercing. For a moment, Alden thought she might actually answer. But then she walked away, boots crunching softly against the dirt, leaving him with nothing but his suspicions. Back in town, her legend only grew. Children drew pictures of her, with chalk on the schoolhouse wall, her rifle glowing like a holy relic, her Bible surrounded by halos. Merchants crafted tiny wooden figurines of her and sold them to passing travelers. The preacher wove her deeds into scripture, declaring that just as David had his sling and Moses his staff, Hollow Creek had its saint with a rifle. The reverence grew into rituals. Every time she walked into the church, the congregation stood as one. Every time she passed through the marketplace, people paused to bow their heads. When she took water from the well, mothers brought their children to drink after her, claiming it tasted sweeter. The townsfolk began lighting candles at the church steps in her name. She became more than flesh and bone to them. She became myth. But myths are dangerous things. At night, alone in her room, she felt the suffocating weight of their worship. She flipped through her Bible, searching for comfort, but the verses seemed to accuse her instead. All have sinned. The wages of sin is death. Be sure your sin will find you out. She whispered prayers until her voice cracked, but the guilt never lifted. For every 25 saved, she remembered dozens lost. The raids, the robberies, the blood-soaked nights of her past, they lived behind her eyes, haunting her with every cheer, every hymn sung in her name. The people saw a saint. She saw a fraud. One night, as she patrolled the streets, she overheard 2 men at the tavern door. "Mark my words," one said, his voice thick with whiskey. "She's no ordinary woman. She's God's own hand on this earth," the other laughed. "And if she's not? Then God forgive us," the first replied, "because we've built our hope on her." The woman froze in the shadows, their words cutting deeper than any bullet. For the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek, she wondered if staying had been a mistake. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. Because she knew the world well enough to know peace never lasted. Danger would return, and when it did, Hollow Creek would need her, even if they worshipped a lie. For months, the people of Hollow Creek had spoken of her only in reverence. Every word, every glance, every story painted her as a savior. Yet reverence is a fragile thing. It only takes a seed of doubt, planted in the right soil, to begin breaking through. The seed came quietly, without ceremony. It began with a drifter. He stumbled into town one afternoon, a ragged man with sunburned skin and eyes too sharp for someone so thin. He sat at the tavern bar, drinking cheap whiskey, until the conversation around him turned, as it always did, to the saint of Hollow Creek. "She saved the Miller twins," a farmer boasted. "She stopped that ox with one clean shot," the blacksmith added. "She's touched by God," the barkeep declared. The drifter only smirked, swirling his drink. "Touched by God, is she? Or touched by the devil? I seen a woman once, rifle on her back, eyes like a hawk. She didn't save folks. She killed him." The tavern fell quiet. "Careful with your words, stranger," the barkeep warned. But the drifter only leaned forward, his voice low. All I'm saying is saints don't come from nowhere. Folks like that don't just appear. They come from something. And that something ain't always clean. By morning, the drifter was gone, but his words lingered. They clung to ears like burrs, sharp and hard to shake off. Whispers began. Small ones at first. I wonder where she came from. Strange, ain't it, how she never talks about herself? Funny, how good she is with that rifle. Too good. The questions spread like smoke. Not enough to choke, but enough to sting. And Sheriff Alden, who had been waiting for such cracks, leaned into them. He began asking his own questions. Quiet ones, careful ones. He sent letters to nearby towns, inquiries disguised as routine law business. He pressed travelers for stories of women with rifles, with eyes sharp and hands steady. He spent long evenings in his office, poring over old wanted posters that yellowed with age. And slowly, a picture began to form. It wasn't clear, not yet, but the outlines suggested something darker than sainthood. Meanwhile, the woman felt the shift in the air. She noticed the sideways glances, the silences that fell too quickly when she entered a room. The way conversations ended not with praise, but with questions. One afternoon, as she walked through the marketplace, a boy no older than 10 tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked, "Mama, was she always good? Or was she bad once?" The mother shushed him quickly, but the words lodged in the woman's chest. That night, she sat in her room, staring at the rifle leaning against the wall. The metal gleamed in the lamplight, familiar and haunting. She thought of the men she had shot, the raids she had ridden with, the blood that had once stained her hands. Her past was a wound, and Hollow Creek was peeling the bandage away. Still, she did not leave. When a family's wagon overturned on the North Road, she was there, pulling the injured free. When wolves threatened the sheep in the lower pastures, she drove them off with steady shots. Her count rose, her legend grew, but the whispers followed like shadows. The preacher tried to silence them. "Do not let doubt poison your faith," he thundered from the pulpit. "The Lord works through her hands. To question her is to question God himself." But sermons could not erase suspicion. If anything, they made people wonder why the preacher defended her so fiercely. Sheriff Alden's suspicions hardened into certainty one cold evening when a reply arrived from a distant marshal. The letter described a woman who had once ridden with a notorious gang, ruthless, efficient, feared across 3 states. A woman with a rifle. A woman whose description matched too closely to be coincidence. Alden read the words by lantern light, the shadows long on his office walls. His jaw tightened. So it was true. She wasn't sent by God. She was running from her past. But Alden didn't move immediately. He closed the letter, tucked it into his drawer, and stared out the window toward the church steeple. He knew the truth was a dangerous thing. The town needed her, needed their saint. To rip away their belief too soon could shatter Hollow Creek all over again. Still, truth had a way of surfacing. And it did, slowly, painfully. The blacksmith's wife swore she saw a tattoo on the woman's arm, one evening when her sleeve slipped, a faded mark, the kind gangs wore to brand themselves. She didn't tell anyone outright, but whispers carried faster than facts. A ranch hand claimed he recognized her face from an old wanted poster he'd seen years ago. A merchant passing through said he'd heard stories of a female outlaw, sharp-eyed and deadly, who vanished after a bloody raid. Piece by piece, the saint's halo began to tarnish. A woman felt it more each day. The smiles seemed tighter, the bows less reverent. The candles at the church steps flickered out faster, fewer lit than before. Where once people reached out to touch her coat, now some pulled their children back, unsure. Her prayers grew longer. Her nights grew colder. And still she wondered, Could 25 saved outweigh the countless lost? Could sainthood erase sin? Or was this all an illusion, a fragile glass waiting to shatter? Sheriff Alden knew the shattering was coming. He watched her walk the streets with her Bible and rifle, watched the town cling to its hope, watched the doubt spread like cracks in ice. He knew it was only a matter of time before the truth emerged. And when it did, Hollow Creek would not see a saint. They would see what she had always known herself to be: an outlaw, a sinner, a woman haunted by the weight of lives she could never repay. The first crack didn't come with a gunshot or a raid. It came with a poster. It was a dry, windy afternoon when a stagecoach rattled into Hollow Creek, carrying a load of travelers and parcels. Among the mail delivered to the sheriff's office was a packet of old wanted notices documents being circulated across towns in the region, urging vigilance against fugitives still at large. Sheriff Alden didn't need to open the packet. He already knew what he would find. Still, when he pulled out the brittle paper and saw her face staring back at him, sketched in hard lines of ink, his stomach knotted. There she was, rifle slung over her back, eyes cold and fierce. Beneath her likeness, the words were bold and unyielding. Wanted, dead or alive. Maria Creed, former member of the Black Vultures gang. Murder, robbery, arson. Reward, $2,000. Maria Creed. That was her name. The sheriff sat in silence, the wind rattling against his window. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was truth, ink on paper, staring him down. He kept the poster tucked away for days, uncertain how to act. But Hollow Creek had its own ways of uncovering secrets. The blacksmith's apprentice was the one who found it. He'd been delivering horseshoes to the sheriff's office when his curious eyes spotted the packet on the desk. By nightfall, the poster had made its way to the tavern, and from there it spread faster than fire in dry grass. By morning, the whole town knew. The saint of Hollow Creek was an outlaw. The shift was immediate, brutal. Where once people bowed their heads in awe, they now turned away in disgust. The candles at the church steps were snuffed out. The children who once followed her with chalk drawings now hid behind their mothers' skirts. Neighbors who once called her blessed now muttered words like murderer, deceiver, fraud. The preacher stood at his pulpit that Sunday, red-faced and trembling. "We have been deceived," he thundered. "The devil wears many disguises, and we mistook sin for sainthood. She is not God's messenger, she is a wolf in sheep's clothing." Gasps filled the pews. Some wept openly. Others clenched their fists in rage. And through it all, she sat in the front row, her Bible pressed to her chest, her face pale but calm. She did not rise to defend herself. She did not deny it, because it was true. When the service ended, the congregation spilled into the square, their voices rising in angry waves. "She lied to us. She's dangerous. God forgive us for worshiping her." Sheriff Alden stood on the church steps, watching it unfold. He saw her standing a few feet away, still as stone, the rifle heavy across her back. For a moment, their eyes met. He expected her to run, to vanish into the hills like the outlaw she had once been. But she didn't move. She stayed, and that unsettled him more than anything. That evening, the town gathered in the saloon for what felt like a trial without a judge. Voices clashed, each louder than the last. Some demanded she be driven out, others that she be arrested and hanged. "She's a killer," a rancher shouted. "You've all heard the stories of the Black Vultures. They burned, they robbed, they slaughtered without mercy. And she rode with them. She saved our children." Another argued, though his voice was weaker, uncertain. "Because she's trying to wash her sins away," came the reply. The debate raged, fueled by fear and betrayal. Meanwhile, She sat alone in her room at the boarding house, listening to the muffled roar of voices outside. She held the wanted poster in her hands, the inked face staring back at her. Maria Creed, that was who she was. Who she had been. The woman they had worshipped, the saint of Hollow Creek, had never truly existed. Sheriff Alden was the one who finally sought her out. He found her at dawn, sitting on the church steps, the Bible in her lap, the rifle leaning against her shoulder. "They know," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "I know. You could run. No one would stop you. Not now." She shook her head slowly. "Running doesn't change what I've done." Alden studied her face, the weariness carved deep into it. "You've saved 25 lives here. Maybe more. Doesn't that count for something?" Her eyes lifted at last, sharp and steady. "Does it? Tell me, Sheriff, does 25 make up for 50? For 100? He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. By midday, the crowd had gathered again, restless and angry. They demanded she face them, demanded she answer for her past. And so she did. She walked into the square, her rifle slung across her back, her Bible in her hand. And murmurs rose like a storm, faces twisted with anger and fear. Children peered from behind their parents, wide-eyed and confused. She stood at the center, unflinching. "It's true," she said at last, her voice carrying across the square. It was the first time most had ever heard her speak, and the sound silenced the crowd. "I was Maria Creed. I rode with the black vultures. I killed. I burned. I stole. My hands are not clean, and they never will be." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "But I left," she continued. "I left because I could not live with the blood anymore. I came here because I thought, maybe I could tip the scales. Maybe if I saved enough lives, God would forgive me." She looked around, meeting their eyes one by one. "I never asked for your worship. I never asked to be your saint. I am no saint. I am a sinner, trying to make peace with her soul before death comes for her too." Silence followed. Heavy, suffocating. Then the shouts began. "Liar! Murderer! Get out!" Some threw stones, small ones at first. One struck her shoulder. Another glanced off the rifle at her back. She didn't flinch. She simply stood, absorbing their anger as if it were her penance. Sheriff Alden pushed through the crowd, raising his voice. "Enough. She's confessed. You wanted the truth, now you have it. Let her speak her piece." But the crowd's fury was not so easily quieted. Betrayal burned deeper than gratitude. The people who had once lit candles in her name now wanted to see her driven into the dust. She turned to Alden then, her face calm despite the chaos. "It's all right," she said softly. "They have every right to hate me." And with that, she walked away from the square, through the jeers and curses, each step heavy but steady. The saint of Hollow Creek had fallen. In her place stood Maria Creed, outlaw, sinner and woman with a past that no number of saved lives could erase. That night, the church stood dark, the candles cold. The townsfolk locked their doors and whispered of betrayal. Hollow Creek, once united in worship, now splintered in anger. And in her room, Maria Creed sat alone, the wanted poster spread on the table, her Bible open beside it. Between them lay her rifle, polished and silent. Her past had found her. Her sainthood was gone. But her story wasn't finished. Not yet. The night after her secret was revealed, Hollow Creek was a town divided. Some demanded Maria Creed's immediate hanging. Others argued she should be driven out, left to wander until the wilderness claimed her. A few, though fewer each day, whispered that 25 lives saved meant something, even if her hands were stained. But in Maria's small room at the boarding house, she didn't wonder what they would decide. She knew it didn't matter. The truth was out. Whatever came next, she would accept it. What she didn't know was that her choice would be made for her by the very darkness she had once belonged to. It began with smoke. At dawn, thick black plumes rose from the east. By the time the church bells rang, riders appeared on the horizon, men with guns, faces masked in red bandanas, their laughter carrying across the hills. The black vultures. Her past had arrived. The gang swept down on Hollow Creek with fire and fury. Bullets tore through windows, barns went up in flames, and terrified families scrambled for cover. The people who had once called Maria a saint now screamed and panicked, unarmed and unprepared. Sheriff Alden barked orders, but his handful of deputies were no match. The town was seconds from ruin. And then Maria stepped into the street. Her rifle gleamed in the rising sun, her eyes cold and steady. For the first time, she wasn't hiding from her past. She was facing it. The gang leader spotted her and laughed. "Well, I'll be damned." Maria Creed herself. "Thought you were dead." Or worse, gone soft. Maria's voice was steady, though her heart thundered. "I'm gun running, Calhoun. You think one woman with a rifle's gonna stop us?" His men roared with laughter. "This town ain't yours to protect. It's ours to burn." Maria raised her rifle. "Then you'll have to burn me first." The first shot cracked like thunder. One of the vultures toppled from his horse before he could draw. Another fell as Maria swung her rifle in a swift, precise arc. The streets erupted into chaos, horses screaming, townsfolk fleeing, gunfire exploding in every direction. But Maria didn't move like prey anymore. She moved like judgment itself. Each shot found its mark. Every bullet saved another life. She fired from rooftops, from alleyways, from the open street, never missing, never faltering. The count, once whispered in reverence, rose again in blood and smoke. Sheriff Alden fought beside her, his revolver blazing, but even he knew the truth. Without her, Hollow Creek would already be ash. The townsfolk watched from behind shuttered windows, disbelief etched across their faces. The woman they had cursed the night before was now the only barrier between them and slaughter. But the fight was not without cost. A bullet grazed her arm. Another tore through her side, leaving her gasping for breath. Still, she pressed on, teeth clenched, eyes burning with a fury that felt less like vengeance and more like absolution. The gang leader, Calhoun, dismounted at last, drawing his revolver with a sneer. "Always knew you'd die with a rifle in your hands, Maria. Just didn't think it'd be for these sheep." Maria staggered, blood seeping through her shirt, but her grip never wavered. "They're not sheep," she said. "They're better than us. Better than I ever was. And I'll die to keep them that way." Their duel was quick, brutal. Calhoun fired first, his bullet grazing her shoulder. She dropped to one knee, raised her rifle, and with a final steady breath, pulled the trigger. Calhoun fell where he stood. The gang broke. The surviving vultures fled into the hills, leaving their leader in the dirt and Hollow Creek trembling in silence. When the smoke cleared, Maria was still standing. Barely. Her rifle slipped from her hands, clattering to the ground. Her knees buckled, and Sheriff Alden rushed to catch her as she collapsed. "You're bleeding out," he said, his voice breaking. She pressed the Bible into his hands, her blood staining its cover. Don't let them forget," she whispered. "Not the outlaw, not the saint, just the woman who tried." Her eyes closed, her chest rose once more, and then fell for the last time. Maria Creed was gone. The town buried her on the hill overlooking Hollow Creek, the place where she had first stood guard with a rifle across her back. Some wept, some stood in silence. Others still muttered their doubts. But none could deny that she had saved them. The preacher spoke at her grave, his voice softer than it had ever been. She was no saint, he admitted. She was no angel. She was a sinner, as we all are. But in her final hour, she gave her life to protect those who cursed her. And if that is not grace, I do not know what is. The townsfolk lit candles once more, not in worship, but in memory. Not as a saint, not as an outlaw, but as Maria Creed, a woman who carried both darkness and light, who bore her sins, but still chose to fight for others. The legend of Hollow Creek would live on, not of a flawless saint, nor of a ruthless outlaw, but of a woman who, in the end, proved that redemption isn't found in perfection. It's found in the choices we make when all else is stripped away. And so the count ended, not at 25, but at countless lives spared on the day Maria Creed made her final stand. Her name would be spoken for years to come, not with hymns, but with respect. Not as the saint of Hollow Creek, not as the outlaw Maria Creed, but as both. Because she had been both. And she had given everything she had left to make that truth enough.